course, we kept the price side of that, price loss coverage. We still have that today as well. That was the 14 Farm Bill. And then the 18 Farm Bill essentially was a status quo bill. It maintained what we had. It really did not make any significant budget adjustments, but it maintained what we had. And its maybe most unique relevance today is that's the last Farm Bill that actually got passed, the last full Farm Bill to make it to the finish line. All three of those bills also stand out for the difficulty it took to get to the finish line. And that's one of the challenges that we see today.
That idea that the 2018 Farm Bill was largely a hold-it-together status quo bill and the last one to actually make it to the finish line helps explain why farm policy feels stuck in extension mode today. In his latest policy report column for Nebraska Farmer magazine, Brad Lubben takes a longer, historical view of how the Farm Bill and ag policy have evolved over time and why each major shift, from price supports to income support to today's risk management framework, have made the process more complicated, not less. Understanding this history may help explain why farm bills have struggled to pass in recent years and why partial fixes have become the norm. That's right now on Nebraska Farmcast. From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast. I'm Ryan Evans with the Center for Ag Profitability, inviting you to check out all of our farm and ranch management resources for agricultural decision makers on our website at cap.unl.edu. Dr. Brad Lubben is an extension ag policy specialist here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His monthly policy report column in Nebraska Farmer often helps put current farm policy debates into context. His latest column walks through the key legislative turning points that shaped today's farm bills and helps explain why getting a new one across the finish line has been so difficult. You can find his latest column at nebraskafarmer.com, as well as linked to in the notes to this podcast and on our Center for Agricultural Profitability's website at cap.unl.edu. Brad, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Ryan.
So the Farm Bill's roots date back to the 1930s and 40s. What was that early legislation trying to solve, and how did that early structure that came into play help shape farm policy for the next decades?
Yes, we're talking about farm policy that's essentially almost 100 years old here at this point. It actually started even earlier than that in the decades prior, some pushes for agricultural assistance or some pushes to try and help the ag economy. It culminated in the Agricultural Act of 1933. That was the first Farm Bill, as we know them by that moniker now. But it was really fundamentally written for the times at that point, with low farm income and the need to try and prop up farm income. Well, the tool that was selected in 1933, or the method that was selected in 1933, really focused on trying to manage supplies in an attempt to prop up prices, in an attempt to prop up farm income. And that method, or that goal, fundamentally had existed for decades and sort of described traditional farm policy for many, many years.
And in fact, it's worth noting that I always find this interesting. Was it the 1949 Farm Bill is what
right.
Everything would revert to if there was nothing passed or extended now, right?
That's right. There's some specific language in 1949 relative to support programs that does not have an expiration date. Well, every farm bill since has an expiration date. And if a modern farm bill expires and we don't do something new, we don't just shut out the lights and shut off programs and go home. We revert to that last farm bill without an expiration date. And as long as that language stays, then we always have this hammer, so to speak, to make sure that we get something done to avoid reverting to decades-old legislation that really doesn't work in the modern world.
And then moving forward into the next decades, why were the 1970s the next big inflection point for ag policy?
1973 was unique, and the Farm Bill of 73 really paved the way for modern farm programs as we know them today. We really shifted away from traditional price support programs and toward income support programs. And that sounds like an esoteric sort of ag economist, delineation. But the old traditional model said if we can control supplies, we can prop up prices to support farm income. the newer model said, but in an era of international competition and increased reliance on global trade and activity, trying a domestic policy of reducing supplies really doesn't fundamentally work because international competitors could easily fill the gap. And so supply control began to disappear from the attention, or at least the goal, and it became more about simply trying to prop up farm income while doing it so with direct payments. Still fundamentally and likely tied to a price at the time, but a target price where we simply paid the difference between that target price and what the market eventually settled at versus trying to restrict supplies to maintain that specific price. So we gradually shifted toward income support, starting with the 1973 Farm Bill. That was the introduction of what many producers would know as target prices and deficiency payments that stayed with us for several decades thereafter. It's also worth noting that 1973 Farm Bill is also the first instance when farm support programs and food assistance programs both became part of the underlying bill. There were efforts and certainly pushes prior to that, some food stamp pilot programs and so forth in the decades previous. But this was fundamentally the beginning of the Farm and Food Coalition.
And then fast forward 20 years or so, you write about the significance of the 1996 Farm Bill. Can you talk about how that was a break from the past and what that bill's legacy is today? Yeah,
the 96 Farm Bill that some producers would remember was often called the Freedom to Farm Act. It instituted the idea of direct payments to producers that were not tied to what they produce. So even when we had shifted from supply control and price support toward income support, we were still fundamentally restricting producers' production decisions. You had to produce what was in your base, your historical plantings, in order to receive support on that commodity. 96 said, let's decouple that. Let's move away from the last remnants of supply control. So no more set-aside or acreage reduction requirements to participate in programs. No more supply control, just simply making payments directly to producers when market prices or conditions warrant. That was the end of the end of the supply control and price support era. Technically, that was the end of that era for everything except sugar, which is a unique commodity in farm legislation and sort of lives on its own little chapter with some import restrictions and tariffs that help to regulate the domestic sugar supply. So that's its own chapter, but in the broader chapter, we fundamentally really got rid of supply control with the 96 Farm Bill.
And then you've highlighted how the last three farm bills have unique aspects to them. Can you talk about why those were so unique and then their roles in just the evolution of ag policy?
Yeah. If we think about the last three farm bills that were completed in 2008, 2014, and 2018, they all helped to introduce this shift toward risk management as opposed to purely income support as part of the underlying commodity programs. So if I back up just a moment, I might also say there's this sort of third era of farm support as I read it and analyze it, a focus more on risk management. So if you go from price support to income support, and we're gradually transitioning toward risk management, that included the introduction of private delivery of crop insurance and the increased federal support for crop insurance. It also, in my book at least, includes the design of commodity programs that still provide income support, but they increasingly look like risk tools because they increasingly are driven based on moving average prices or revenues instead of a purely fixed guarantee. Okay, so there's a little bit of element of modifying how programs work in those three bills, and 2008 was the one that introduced those, something at the time we called the ACRE program, the Average Crop Revenue Election Program, effectively a moving average revenue guarantee. Okay. The 2014 Farm Bill continued that trend towards a revenue safety net as compared to a price safety net. That's when we introduced the Agriculture Risk Coverage Program, which we still have today. Of course, we kept the price side of that, price loss coverage. We still have that today as well. That was the 14 Farm Bill. And then the 18 Farm Bill essentially was a status quo bill. It maintained what we had. It really did not make any significant budget adjustments, but it maintained what we had. And its maybe most unique relevance today is that's the last farm bill that actually got passed, the last full farm bill to make it to the finish line. All three of those bills also stand out for the difficulty it took to get to the finish line. And that's one of the challenges that we see today.
Yeah, and why Farm Bill language was put ultimately into the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, right, which addressed commodity programs, crop insurance, conservation, food assistance.
Right. If we think about the challenge of these last three bills, in 2008, the Farm Bill actually had to survive a veto. Technically, for those really interested in trivia, it had survived 2 vetoes because the first legislation sent to the president that was vetoed was overridden, but it was missing a chapter. So they had to do it again, vetoed again, overridden again. That was the 2008 Farm Bill. The 2014 Farm Bill survived a no vote on the floor of the House, where it fell in a vote but was resurrected in separate farm legislation and eventually food assistance legislation before it was effectively remarried with the Senate version to get to the finish line. The 2018 Farm Bill also died in a no vote on the floor of the House before it was reconsidered and moved forward. So the last 3 bills have had difficulty even though they got to the finish line, but it also has paved the way, or at least sort of set the stage for the difficulty we see today in trying to get a full farm bill under consideration. When the 18 Farm Bill expired in 2023, we saw no action, and all we saw was an extension for 1 year. We did see action in 2024 in the House Ag Committee that produced a bipartisan bill out of committee, but it also didn't go any further, and the Senate didn't produce any action, and we saw another extension into 2025. Well, with that kind of track record, it was not surprising that the alternative avenue in 2025 was to take the major spending parts of the bill and put them in what became the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That's the commodity programs, the crop insurance programs, the conservation programs, and the food assistance programs. That language at least made it to the finish line in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, given that we couldn't seem to get a full farm bill there.
And with the rest of the Farm Bill left untouched, then, are there lesser known programs, aside from what was addressed in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that might quietly matter more just as much than many producers realize?
Right. Well, there are lots of programs that rely on, you're right, the rest of the language. Those 4 big parts, commodities, conservation, crop insurance, food assistance, that's 99% of the spending in a farm bill. But the rest of the programs are pretty substantial and pretty important. And they expired again in September of 2025 before we saw a late year, 1 year extension passed yet again, with the promise and some movement here to try and work on that language here in 2026. It doesn't seem like the big things, like I said, with 99% of the spending may be addressed, but yet there are various programs that don't have authority unless they are extended by that ongoing Farm Bill language. Even in the conservation title, which was addressed, but it didn't include the continuation of this Conservation Reserve Program. That program has an authorized acreage capacity, not a spending capacity. Therefore, changes to spending were not part of the debate. Therefore, it couldn't be included in the budget bill. That means that authority for CRP expired in September for any contracts going forward until they saw that 1 year extension. But that's one of those programs that relies on getting the actual farm bill to the finish line. Farm loan programs, rural development programs, authorization for research and education funding, and many other categories rely on getting a farm bill to the finish line.
So what forces are in play today that you think are most likely to influence what the next farm bill could actually look like?
Yeah. You know, there's competing forces here, and one of the challenges is that the Farm and Food Coalition that we mentioned was really a creation of the 1973 Farm Bill, was either severely tested or at least outright sort of killed with the language that moved forward in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Substantial increases to commodity program and crop insurance program support, paid for in part by substantial cuts or reforms to the food assistance programs. And I say cuts or reforms depending upon which side of the aisle you're on, matters which word you want to use there. But substantial reductions in spending on food assistance programs really sort of alienated that traditional farm and food coalition. Whether that coalition can come together in the future to build consensus on a full farm bill remains to be seen. In some sense, we don't really need to test that theory for a few years here because we've got the major parts authorized through 2031 in terms of commodity programs, and we've just got this remaining language in a farm bill. But even if farm and food isn't part of the debate, it's a question as whether the coalition has enough strength to even move the minor parts of the bill forward here. So there's a real test of farm and food sort of coalition strength and consensus building towards a farm bill. There's also the reality that with commodity programs in place through 2031, or at least authorized through 2031, there's less impetus or less sort of economic attention to what needs to get done and what might we do in a farm bill. In the meantime, there's been all kinds of ad hoc assistance rolled out the door, both passed in Congress and announced by the Secretary of Agriculture or USDA. So it's a real uncertain time for the traditional farm bill model and the traditional path for getting farm programs across the finish line.
Yeah, and so when you think about, or if you look at agriculture today, modern agriculture, the production technology, the risk environment that agriculture is in, do you see any elements of the Farm Bill framework as it's existed that are outdated given where we are today?
Yeah. Oh, I think there is a continual challenge for policymakers and for ag groups too, to sort of look at the development of the safety net that we've had over time. Think of the commodity program safety net. It's fundamentally built to support farm income and reduce risk. We have the ARC and PLC programs. By the time those programs' new authorization expires in 2031, we will have operated with ARC and PLC longer than anything we've had since the target price deficiency payment days. I almost describe it as the new semi-permanent farm bill. It doesn't have that permanent language authority, but it is fundamentally the farm bill that we know and use today. But yet it's still a debate about how does it work? And the ultimate question that we often ask is how much support is needed? While the bigger question might be what kind of support is needed, or is support needed? Those are sort of fundamental existential questions of what is the farm bill for and how should it work, as opposed to spending all our time analyzing, but how big is it? And how much support is going where? That's a real question that we have on the farm side of the ledger. With the increases in support for crop insurance, we also have the balance of how much of this should come through traditional sort of commodity support and how much of this is coming through increased support for producer risk management decision making. Now, I help to run a center that helps support risk management education programming, so I may have a bias or at least a perception of the value of risk management and risk management education, but it is clearly a divide in farm legislation of the role of farm programs, traditional commodity programs, versus the role of risk management programs. And that's something we got to figure out.
Well, speaking of risk management, are there signals that you would encourage ag producers to watch over the next year or so, just to understand where Farm Bill programs affected in negotiations are headed?
Yeah, I think we want to watch any effort at Farm Bill development here to see whether there is, in fact, a coalition, whether there's a bipartisan consensus to move legislation at all, or whether we've really sort of destroyed the traditional 50-year-old coalition. If we don't have a coalition, it becomes increasingly difficult to figure out how a farm bill gets to the finish line, in spite of the fact that we did manage to do some fairly substantial things through a budget reconciliation bill that defied sort of the assumption that we needed a coalition. So we've tested that theory. It remains to be seen going forward what we can do. It's also quite plausible. This is not necessarily an optimistic outlook, but it's quite plausible that if the big parts of the Farm Bill are really taken care of for the moment, that the impetus to do something big with the rest of the Farm Bill kind of gets pushed to the wayside. And while there are efforts to address the Farm Bill, it's also possible to imagine that the default is we find a way to simply keep moving it forward 1 year at a time until we get to that ultimatum when we have to handle the whole thing again.
Yeah, we've talked before about perhaps we're living in the age now of just extensions and ad hoc assistance as a means of getting this by. And so we'll stay tuned to it and look forward to talking to you again in the coming months. That's Dr. Brad Lubben, Extension Ag Policy Specialist here at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And you can find his monthly policy report column in Nebraska Farmer magazine. And we have linked to his latest column in the notes to this podcast and on our Center for Ag Profitability's website at cap.unl.edu. Thanks, Brad.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Nebraska Farmcast, a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Ryan Evans, and you can find a host of farm and ranch management resources, including articles, decision tools, videos, and more on the Center for Agricultural Profitability's website, cap.unl.edu.